Hey, everybody. So, welcome to 151, which is modern social problems. Depending on what university you're at, the numbers might actually be a little different. But we're going to talk about the bigger or more widely understood and talked about topics that provide social disarray. So, in this class, we're going to talk about a lot of hot button topics. We're going to talk about a lot of politically charged topics. We're going to talk a lot about topics that cause confrontation in possibly some of your everyday lives or in conversations you've had with others. So before I get really started, this lecture is really just going to be about some of the things from the intro and from the book chapter that are really terminology, basic sociology terminology that you're going to be using and hearing a lot when you talk about social problems. And then I also wanted to kind of touch base and just say, hey, listen, language is going to be very important in this class. We're going to talk a lot about language. We're going to talk a lot about how to have conversations from a sociological perspective, where we talk about things that impact everybody's individual lives, but do so because of the way society operates or the norms of society, or possibly how an institution is run in society. And these things have lots of consequences, both at an individual level and a structural level. So we are going to be, again, talking about things that have been in the media a lot, talk about things that have been on social media a lot, things that people talk about. And in doing so, we're gonna hit some buttons. I have no intention of making anyone in this class feel unwelcome or like they are not being heard or are not being their point of view is not represented. That being said, I am a critical sociologist. My job is to essentially draw attention to where sociology could be using their science to better advocate for marginalized populations. I also recognize that my own positionality is one of a white, female, disabled, queer woman. And I say that not because I am trying to garner any kind of pity or even like any kind of reaction. I say that because acknowledging our own positionality also allows us to acknowledge the positionalities we can never hold. I will never be a person of color. And because of that, I will never understand fully what it means to walk in this world as a person of color. No matter how much I read, no matter how much I intend to make a world where it is not the case, I will never feel the discrimination that a person of color will feel. Moving forward, I will say this about a lot of different marginalized groups. I am also a part of several marginalized groups. However, even within those marginalized groups, my whiteness can impact how I can operate within those spaces and what I can and cannot do within our broader society. And I say all of that because I want us to keep a very, very conscious check on ourselves when we experience those in this class and we share experiences with each other and or which you are never obligated to do. But when we talk about the world and how it operates, I want us to make sure that we, especially in a class like this, are taking the time to step back out of ourselves as much as we can, acknowledging our own biases and our own understandings and our own social space, and attempting to listen and hear and put forth the effort to make sure that we also are being the best allies we can for those not in positions that we carry. All right, enough with the preaching preaching, Professor Bowen. Let's get to the more basic stuff. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And this is kind of how these lectures are going to go. I will always share these PowerPoints or the Prezzies, depending on what I decided to do that week. But I will do so with an adjoining lecture that will allow you to be able to kind of be walked through it so you understand. So if there's some shorthand in there, you understand what it means. These things should be fairly quick and easy. This should be a pretty easy recap of some basic terminology. There we go. All right. So our sociological imagination, which is also called our sociological perspective. It's a term that was coined by C. Wright Mills, one of our early sociologists. And it also it's talking about the way in which we view a situation, especially in this class, is going to be how we view that social problem. And essentially it allows us to understand, again, like I was just talking about, how those individual interactions or individual experiences are shaped and molded by society and the views that we hold as norms, but also how we as a society and the individuals within it shape those norms. Okay. And we're going to kind of, again, get into a lot of this, and your sociological imagination is something that I'm going to talk about throughout the course because it's just the perspective we're going to use. And kind of go through that. So some of the definitions related to your sociological imagination, personal troubles, or that those personal experiences that we have that are specific to, in this case, a social problem, right? So whether it be poverty, maybe, whether it be a lack of available fresh foods. And we'll get into, garner a plethora of examples of this, but we're going to talk about a personal trouble in reference to how it is shaped or made possible by all of the different forces within society that shape and mold us. We're going to talk about our social location, and I kind of got into positionality a little bit earlier, and our positionality is really just another word for our social location. And essentially it's not only just the physical spaces we are in. So like the geographic location, yes, the spaces that we hold dear also, or the places in which we operate frequently that shape and mold our understandings of the world, also make up our social location. But on top of that, you're also going to see your identities. You're going to see your things like I listed off, right? Like white, female, cis, disabled, queer, right? Like these things are going to be part of the social location, or is essentially where we are positioned within a wide number of social hierarchies and within our society, and kind of how we can position ourselves in reference to all of these other things, whether it be a social institution like maybe the legal system, or maybe it's in reference to another person, right? Or in reference to even a role that we have. So in reference to maybe where you are in your job. Are you the boss? Are you a assistant? Are you a sales clerk that you work under somebody? Are you, so all of these things are going to be the positionality that you hold within the world. And depending on what social problem you're talking about, your positionality can impact greatly how you view it, how personal it is to you, how much it actually impacts your life. And we'll get into that kind of throughout multiple of our conversations. So when we talk about social context, that's when we're talking about several different layers, right? We're going to not just talk about, again, that individual interaction or that intimate, that micro level sociology, which really focuses on interaction or personal experiences, right? So it's going to focus very much at, I am here, I'm in a room with, say, my kids. And that interaction is going to shape how my kids end up going and moving through the world. Why? Because I am teaching them how to be little humans, right? And so that interaction in and of itself is kind of, we could examine those micro interactions of those parenting moments and we could make some sociological observations, right? However, we also, as sociologists, understand that my understanding of the world, say my education, impacts the way I parent, right? And so we can pull that micro level situation and make it more broad and talk about the way I've experienced the world, the resources I had available to me, and the way in which my status as an educated person impacts the way I parent, and especially my status as a social scientist who specifically works in essentially applied sociology and about diversity really impacts the way my kids experience the world and the difference they may have than, say, someone whose parent is a nurse, or someone, they might focus more on physical health, or someone's parent who is an engineer who is very adamant that they work on math skills and certain things, right? Like, we're going to take the things that we know about the world or the things that have influenced us at this broader, bigger societal level, and we're going to take them into our interpersonal interactions or micro level interactions. And so, just to recap, those macro level, those broad kind of social contexts, that big whole society picture, those big whole institution pictures, right? Those are the things that we are shaped and molded by, but we also have influence on. And then we talk about those micro level interactions, and those are kind of those more one-on-ones, right? Those are those very much like intimate, more narrow focused. Okay. And then you can also look at kind of this middle ground, and that happens often where we're relaying back and forth and kind of volleying to see how those two interact, right? But you're going to see also some narrow social contexts, which are really about specific social identities, right? Those are going to be about groups. Those are going to be about maybe a specific institution. We might be studying specifically one college in the social institution of higher education, right? And so you can also get a very narrow focus that's not a one-on-one, those micro level interactions, if that makes sense. All right. So let's move on. So elements of a social problem. So these are going to be pretty straightforward. A social problem is really an issue within society, a concern that people have that is raised to the level that they want change to happen in one way or another. It doesn't have to be that everybody wants change in the same way, right? And your book kind of talks about that when it talks about throwing you into abortion in the very first week of the course. So they're also understood as socially constructed. And by that, we mean that when something is socially constructed, we shape and mold how we think about it. So when society's opinions start to gravitate towards these massive change, then so does how we interact or how we talk about this social issue. I'll give a good example. When we talk about gay marriage now, or same-sex marriage now, compared to when we talked about it when I was young, or didn't talk about it when I was young, there were very, very different realities about that. We now have a society where 80% plus of people support gay marriage. And because of that, it has become part of our media to an extent. It has become part of our understanding of how the world works. It may not even be something you necessarily agree with at a personal level, but it is still something you acknowledge happens in society and acknowledge is not something that should take away someone's rights. That is a very different view than 30 years ago, right? So 30 years ago, you're going to look at like when I was young, these things weren't talked about. And when they were talked about, it was usually in a very derogatory way and or a very discriminatory way. And so when we say something is socially constructed, what we're saying is that it changes. It's not fixed. It's not stagnant. It is something that is shaped and molded by the way we think and feel. And so a social problem is something in society, an idea in society, that has people having opinions about. And those opinions then are shaping how we respond to that particular social issue. All right. So that's kind of what a social issue is. Things that it has to have is an objective condition. So something that can be measured or experienced. So you have to have something in the topic that can actually happen. It can't be like, hey, we're going to all argue over, I don't know, particular kinds of physics, right? There's not going to be enough people to understand and really talk about this that it's going to be a social problem, right? But then if you get into science and you talk about, say, splicing DNA or particular gene-based medication, you're going to spark a little more of a debate, right? So it's not to say that all science it cannot be measured or experienced, but it's going to say, okay, wait a minute. You're telling me that you're going to take these particular kind of science ideas and you're going to make something that is alive, those cells are alive, out of something else that's alive. How do we feel about that as a society, right? And those are two different things. It has to be able to be measured. And then on top of that, a significant enough people or a number of significant people, which we'll get to in just a second, have to have an opinion on it. And not only do they have to have an opinion, they have to have an opinion where they want to do something about it, right? So, and we say a significant number of people or a number of significant people because often our social problems are elicited out of a number of significant people. So a more small or more socially higher up individuals or positions of leadership or something of that have decided that this is an issue, right? And so they're going to flood specific ideologies into our media, into the way we are shaped and learn, into private conversation or into public conversation, right? And then that concern can grow into a significant number of people. Or it can always end up being about a concern that a particular minority with a good amount of power or privilege is pushing. And we will, I promise you, we will talk a lot about privilege and power when we get into some of those other topics as we move forward. And we're going to do so a little less today. And that's just because time's sake. So the structure of a social problem is one of a couple of things. And this is kind of when we're talking about it being socially constructed, we're talking about a lot of these things, right? It has to be dynamic, which means that there's multiple viewpoints, right? There has to be, it's not straightforward, right? It's not like 2 + 2 = 4, right? If we went and said, a whole bunch of us have decided that it equals 5 and we don't care about counting anymore, there would be a simple solution. Okay, well, we count for this reason and logically this is what we need. So no, this is not going to be a social problem. This couple of people who decided that this is the case are just going to be wrong, right? There's not a super simple answer because there's always more than one kind of vested interest in these social problems. And they carry viewpoints that are very, very close to people's core belief structures. And we'll get into that as we move forward through the course as well. We're also going to talk about them as evolving. Again, they're not stagnant. They change over time. They change due to activism. They change due to social pressure, or even just the amount of attention it's getting in particular sources, etc. And it's relative, which means depending on your social location, you're going to perceive the issue differently, right? So as we talk about abortion, and I'm a woman with a uterus and the ability to birth children, and the ability to, at some point, need life-saving reproductive health care, which could include an abortion, I may view abortion differently than a cis male person who does not have the ability to ever have to carry a child or have any kind of complication within their pregnancy because they cannot be pregnant. Okay. And we're going to talk about these things a little more as we move through the course, but that's just an example related to this thing. So I'm going to see this world a little differently because this is a possibility for my life. Now, I'm done having kids at this point in my life, so that's not really a possibility. But the point being that as a female, I can understand what it's like to be a pregnant person, as I have had 2 children, and I can understand the positionality I might be put in should, after I had had the first one and was already a mom and that child needed me, it would have come down in that second pregnancy to me or the baby or neither or both or whatever it is. Making that decision would have been incredibly, incredibly hard. I'm not sure that I'm pretty sure I pawn that off on the other person in that case. But the point being is that I can have a different perspective, set back and understand what it means to be pregnant and what that means for my body and for the bodies of those who can be pregnant. All right. And lastly, we need some competing views, right? Not everybody can agree, because if everybody can agree on this, then it's not a social issue, right? Because there's no issue in that. The social has all decided that this is the case. If you look at the overwhelming majority of people, they're going to tell you that murder is wrong and that you can't just go around murdering people in the streets, right? If half of the population just randomly decided, you know what, I think this might not be such a bad idea. A, we'd have a lot of conflict, but B, then we could start talking about the fact that these views were competing against each other. Now that's a really ludicrous example, but the point is simple, right? The point is that if you don't have these competing views, then you cannot have a social issue because everybody agrees. And we're going to talk a little bit, and that's not to say that just because you believe wholeheartely that murder is wrong or that it doesn't have a place in society, you wouldn't support your troops in defending your country or what have you, right? So it's not to say that there's no middle ground or wiggle ground if you decide you're primarily on one side of the spectrum when it comes to an issue, right? Because we as human beings understand context, and we understand that nothing is as simple as always this or always this, right? There is always that middle ground. There's always exceptions. There's going to be something that might pop up, some situation that may throw this idea that I have of how the world should work for a loop. And that's part of being human, right? So again, as we walk through this particular topic and any other topic that we talk about in this class, what we all need to understand is for almost everyone that exists, there are exceptions to their ideology, period. Right? No matter where you lie on the line of whatever social issue, there will be at some point somebody could give you some particulars about a specific case or experience of that social issue that you'd be like, well, I mean, in that case, maybe and that's the point, is we're humans. And while we are going to have competing views, that does not mean there is no middle ground and that most people don't live in that middle ground. And as we move forward, we're also going to talk about how social hierarchies affect and how, again, that's going to fall back into that positionality, right? How social hierarchies end up impacting whose views or which views are spoken the loudest, which ones get power, and power just being that ability to make something happen, even with resistance. Even if you are the minority idea, but you have a lot of social power through networking, through the roles you play in the society, et cetera, then your views may be spoken louder, even if you are not the majority opinion. And we're going to kind of get into that as well. All right, let's pop on out of here. So there's 4 stages to a social problem. The first one being kind of defining the problem, right? We have to know what we're talking about. And that's going to be so much as to say, we're going to research it. We're going to look up historical precedent. We're going to talk about how that precedent might be changing, or what in this particular moment is changing the ideas on this, or deciding that it is important enough to be an issue. And that may come from social movements, gaining or fighting for specific rights. It can be something like 2 or more ideologies clashing over something. You're also going to see your emergence of leaders in this. Who's influencing those public opinions, and how are they influencing them? And are those public opinions changing because of this influence? And we'll talk more about this in several different instances. And then we're going to talk about organizing around the issue. So this is going to be when public action starts happening. So stage 2, you're going to get an official response from some kind of leadership, some kind of political entity, some kind of because not all social problems are at a national or international level, right? Some social problems you're going to see in the way of an institution, right? How do we want to create this policy? Do we want to create this policy within a workplace, etc.? So social problems happen in all social settings and can be at every level. And so it could just be a boss deciding that this social policy is in place. But if this social policy goes against maybe the mothers that work there, maybe they're like, whoa, hold on a minute, let's back this up. Let's figure out if this is really the case, right? Maybe it's something like, hey, it is not an excused reason to miss work if your children get called out of school for a snow day or something like that, right? And you can't find childcare. Stuff like that. It can have multiple catalysts that create this moment. Usually the stage is marked by a change in ideology or a moment of a particular source of authority. So somebody with some kind of social presence in that group or in that particular social setting has provided this catalytic moment in order to create that space for conversations around this particular issue. Third, you're going to have a reaction to the social or the official response, right? And this is where language is going to come in case. When you start talking about your reactions, you're going to start really getting into camps. You're going to start talking about the difference in opinions. You're going to start labeling them with specific names, and depending on what side you so we'll use the abortion line of thinking when we talk about language for a second. So if you are on the pro-choice side of things, you may look at yourself as pro-choice. However, someone that is pro-life may look at you and think of you as someone who is murdering children or is okay with children being murdered, right? So there's going to be a very different viewpoint, and that language is going to form how those 2 groups interact. It's going to form how it's going to express thoughts and understandings of this. And for this class, it's going to be something that we have to be incredibly careful about how we talk about specific settings in order to make sure that we don't trample on someone's own lived experience or own personal trauma. Okay. In this, you're also going to see a lot of invigorating of activists and a lot of desire for stimulation of change. We want change. And that's going to be big, bold, and out there. And then last, you're going to develop alternative strategies. So this is when policies are going to get put in place, when court cases are going to happen, when maybe social programs or resources, you're going to see escalation in social movements. Again, not all strategies are equal or necessarily effective, some of which could even be violent, right? You're going to see a lot of accusation between 2 sides, a lot of controversy, and it's going to feel like socially sometimes there is no middle ground, despite the fact that the majority of people are probably still going to end up in that middle ground. But they're going to lean one way or call themselves or situate themselves in a camp generally. And when we talk about this, don't hear me wrong, because some of these things, like the court case, so like we're going to talk about when Roe v. Wade got overturned, right? That's going to be then the next lecture that I do. That particular court case, again, triggered these stages almost all over again, right? And now we're going to talk about this social issue. What do we do in post Roe? Okay. And that social issue is still on the topic of abortion. It's still part of this bigger conversation, even of reproductive justice. However, that particular court case and that particular alternative strategy now has to be studied, and we have to talk about the social consequences, the underlying issues, and the way in which power structures changed due to that, right? All right. So why do we use sociology, and how do we use it? We use sociology because it allows us to measure the who, what, why, when, and how, where, the whole nine about a particular topic, right? We want to measure those particular concerns or the issues themselves. Then we want to measure how people respond to that. What do people think about this? What do they believe? How do they understand this? Where are they getting their information? How does that information impact their views, right? All of these things. And then we want to be able to apply that perspective, right? How are these individualistic ideas or views or these little social bubbles that they're in, or how we learned about the topic, how do those shape, mold, and influence the who, what, where, why, how, when, etc. Okay. And then we're going to evaluate the consequences of particular social solutions, right? So again, as we're doing that now, so a lot of sociologists are focusing on what are going to be the social consequences for women and or those with female anatomy that are going to be forced to carry to term, right? So what does that mean socially for that person? And then so we're also going to talk about values, biases, and social change, because sociologists should understand their own positionality in reference to the issue. And yes, there's a typo in there, and I apologize. Sociologists should also determine if value-free findings are helpful, right? And then we talk about why we do sociology. I am very firm in the camp that you cannot be 100% bias-free in any scientific research question you have. Because you wouldn't be researching it if you didn't have a vested interest in it. If it was not something that mattered to you, and that the point at which you have made it matter, you have already created this bias towards it, good, bad, or otherwise, right? You have given it a value. And because of that, I think it is very hard to take away how we feel about a certain situation when we research it. I think it is more accurate that social scientists do their best to acknowledge their positions, acknowledge the way we create value to a topic, and explain why we give it value, right? And I say that because I'm very much an applied sociologist. So I take what I do in sociology, and then my goal is to elicit some kind of change, to create change, to draw attention to create activism for specific topics, right? So my thesis was, when I went to Oklahoma State University, was about accommodations practices within the classroom for student survivors of violence from the perspective of the professors, right? And so my goal was to then take that information about what it is they wanted to know about, like what trainings they may be interested in, what kind of things they're doing or not doing, what they think is like too much, what resources they know about and how they know about them, and take that into making it some kind of living document that can then go to the university so that they can see a need or a desire for specific kinds of educational continuum or what have you, right? So I'm using that sociology to advocate for better resources, better accommodations, better understandings within our faculty populations. And all of these things I do because I am intentionally wanting to apply what I learn within my research to create a better academic setting for students moving forward. Right. So I know where I sit. I know my position. I know why my position is that way. I understand how my position impacts my research and what I intend to do with it. And in stating all of that, I can then move forward with, and this is what I'm going to do. And this is why, right? And justify it. And that's kind of what I'm saying when I say, so like that's where I vary a little bit because you can't do bias-free research. I don't think that's possible because we all have learned and learned how to understand the world from a particular kind of position, right? Like, again, like I said earlier, I will never understand the experiences a person of color has because I cannot experience them. That does not mean I will not do everything in my power to listen, to hear, and to be as empathetic as I possibly can in order to make the world a place where they do not have experiences that cause them harm in any capacity. Right? So there's a difference there. Just because I can't experience the thing doesn't mean I don't want to change it. It doesn't mean I can't also be one to want to draw attention to the social issue that that person is experiencing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Lastly, how do we study things? And I'm not going to go into depth about these. I'm just going to power through them real quick. We have several different research designs. You have case studies, which is essentially we have a few different situations, one or a few of specific situations with specific different parameters that allow us to see how socially this particular person or a person like this person might interact with this particular social setting, right? And we see that out of this case study, and this case study then goes to have more broad conversations about whatever the topic is. You have surveys, which are basically those lovely documents that come out that ask you a bunch of questions and give you a bunch of options, and you click one or two or however many. In doing those, you're going to get the answers given to you, and you have to choose within those. Not always, but most of the time. Experiments are those things where, hey, we're going to control one particular part of the social setting, or we're going to create social experiences within a controlled setting so that that way we can observe them and figure out how people might interact. So maybe like again, talking about eye contact. So eye contact is something that several social scientists have talked about within different institutions. How does eye contact influence how a judge might react to a defendant, right? So it just depends. Field studies are those things that you're going to see, you're going to have to be out in the world studying something and interacting with that something. Not always, but most of the time. And you gather information through interviews. So these are going to be the things that you're going to get more qualitative answers on a lot of times. And essentially, you're going to be having more open-ended questions. You're going to want the person to talk. You're going to want to get more basis of understanding to maybe make the categories for a later survey or what have you, or to collect more nuanced data. You have questionnaires, which again are very similar to surveys. The difference being that they may be over a more broad conversation than essentially just a study that is a survey that might be based on one particular topic. You have analyzing of documents. So these are going to be your documents that are already in place. You're going to be the data that already exists, and you're going to go through them and figure out kind of what the themes are, what is coming through over and over and over again throughout these documents. And then you have observation, where you are observing in a natural environment, people interacting with other people. And then you have mixed methods, which is just this idea that you're using more than one of these or a variant of one of these, and allowing for your research question to be answered through multiple different ways. All right, so that's all I have for you on that one. I'm going to get into the post-Roe abortion lecture next. And hopefully, as we move forward through that topic, we will remind ourselves that this is a topic that is very charged and that people have very strong emotions about. And we want to make sure that we are doing everything in our power to use language that is not exclusionary and language that is not harmful. Thank you so much. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week.